this symposium on the experiences of Islamic movements in politics and governance. Today, we are examining the experience of Islamic movements in Algeria. In our first session, we had three speakers. In our second session now, we're going to have two speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Qais Isbouni from Algeria, who is going to talk about. And also we have Mr. bin Azouz Abdulrahman from the University of Constantine in Algeria, talking about Islamists in Algeria. After that, after these two presentations, we have Dr. Jalal, who's going to give a general comment about both. Mr. Idris Nouri is a lecturer in sociology in Lemine Dabaghine in Saif University in Algeria. He is a researcher and a lecturer in that university, and I'm member of the Social Studies Center in Lebanon and a researcher on modern Algerian history, society, and he particularly talks about the implications of profit-seeking practices on the democratic transition. Mr. bin Azouz Abdulrahman, he was a teacher of political science in the University of Constantine, Algeria. He has his BA in 2009 in international relations from the University of Constantine and MA in 2014 in comparative policy from the same university. His dissertation was on the role of Islamic movements on democratic transition in Egypt, and this thesis received the award of the best research by the Egyptian Studies Center. He's working on his PhD on a comparative study between Al-Tawheed wal-Islah and Al-Adl wal-Ihsan movements in the Arab Maghreb states. He has many publications and articles. His research focused on Islamic movements around the world, particularly in North Africa, democratic transition, and issues about governance. Mr. Jalal Rashid is an Algerian researcher who lives in Istanbul, and he's currently working with us in SIGA as a first associate researcher in Sabah Din Zaim University. And he is also a teacher of political science in Algeria University. He has his BA from the Al Constantina University in 2009 in international relations, then his MA in 2017 from Algeria University, and another master's from the Middle East Institute from the University of Marmara in Istanbul, Turkey. He has worked as a researcher and associate researcher in many research centers, and he has many articles and studies in both English and Arabic. His work focuses on geopolitics and the theories of international relations, foreign relations in Algeria, Morocco, Turkey, and many other states. He has many publications, including democratic transition in Russia and the impact of international transitions on our transformation on Turkish policy, John Scheimer versus John Scheimer as a rise or demise, and he's working on a further publication right now. I would like to welcome you all. I give the floor now to the first speaker, Dr. Idris Nouri, about the Islamists in Algeria from radical opposition to the arms of the state or the authority. Good afternoon. I am very pleased to be with you. My paper talks about the Islamists of Algeria from the radical opposition to the arms of the state. It tries to understand the history and the roots of this uh, movement and its transformations, in addition to ideological and structural transformations on the Muslim Brotherhood uh, movement in Algeria, which was supported by the authority as a replacement for radical Islamism. And this is based on the assumption that political Islam is not a religious but a political phenomenon, and it is capable of adapting and accommodating according to, and it's not a static movement, but it is one of the manifestations of modernism, and it is one of the aspects of Muslim transition into modernism. After talking about this assumption, I will talk briefly about the methodology of studying Islam as a subject of research. Actually, there are two main approaches to Islam and Islamic movements in general. The first approach is one that looks at Islam as an essential essence that is the pivotal point of which is the Quran and Sunnah, and uh, understanding society by that approach is based on the understanding of the texts of reference that are used for as the reference of this religion. This approach started since the Orientalist era, where Islam was the only lens through which Muslim societies were seen. And so anthropologists used that approach, although they tried to and they claimed to abstain from Orientalism. Their approach was no different from Orientalist approaches, including the work of Ernest Engler, who worked on the Greater Maghreb, in which he reduced all the dynamics within those societies and their ability to move to the modern state under the rule of law, and attributed that only to the Sufi and Islamist views. And although he explains the emergence of the modern state in Europe with the emergence of the industrial revolution, uh, he looks at Europe from a socio-economic point of view, while he reduces Muslim societies to an ideological religious entity, talking about the nuances between the Islam which is based on texts and that which is based on Sufi approach. I'm sorry. Can you speak a bit slower for the translation? And Gilner's approach would have had its weight internally in terms of its methodology, at least if it equated between Protestantism and some Islamic thoughts, or Catholicism and some Islamic schools. However, that wasn't right, and that wasn't the case. So he only viewed Europe in that sense, socio-economic sense, and the Muslim world through his Orientalist lens and a religious point of view. So this double standard in studying history may account for, or may explain why he failed to account for Islamism when it first emerged by the end of 1980s. Islam is now in the Western disciplines and studies has become a matter of study politically and in media and academic terms, and we see a discrepancy between political science and uh, Islam as a religion. All instead of overcoming those contradictions of the ontology and by instead of starting their own methodology, the Muslim countries took the same approaches and imported them, and which ended up with them providing an accusation of Islam, blaming it for being the source of all backwardness and violence, and branded those peoples of this region as people who were unable to liberate themselves from the scripture, which justified the practices of the state, which in crushing and restricting Islamists. While the other approach, which is used in this paper, is, for example, we have gears who overcame this uh, ethnological view, and he looked at Islam not only as the only source, not as the only source of organization within the society, but as part of the manifestations. So there was no Islam that is an essential entity independent from society, but it is a set of values and practices. That's why we have different manifestations of Islam in Pakistan, Malaysia, Morocco, elsewhere, etc. Hence, under this approach, Islam has the horizon to be looked upon as a dynamic factor that it changes according to socio-economic and political conditions, and thus it should be understood accordingly based on understanding the uh, environment. And based on that approach, Muslim societies could no longer be looked at societies that are only governed by religion, but societies like any other societies that have used the sacred text for their political practice when it is in line with their political order, and they use those samples in a dynamic manner. So the use of the sacred scripture may evolve and move from one time to the other, and this approach allowed the look regarding Islamism in a dynamic manner in which the transformations within Islamism are recognized not only at the level of the structure and organization, but also at the level of social practice by individuals and groups, which the political sciences and social sciences cannot do without, particularly that the politics is uh, practiced only within institutions. Just like Christianity cannot be a subject of study within political sciences, Islam cannot be the field of study for political sciences. Although it is one of the factors, but political sciences are unable to account for all the aspects and dimensions of Islam as a religion, as a mobilizing factor. Based on this uh, background, we're going to start with this paper with an overview of the history of Islamic movement in Algeria. Islamism in Algeria has its roots in Muslim uh, societies and countries. We had the Azhari Islam, which was a tradition that resisted all forms of review, and hence Muhammad Abdo started his Nahda or Renaissance ideas within those restrictions, although he tried to overcome some of them by accepting the West it in one level and rejecting it on another, and then Islamism and Muslim Brotherhood became more solidified, consolidated with um, Sayyid Qutb, and then we had Abu Ala al-Mawdudi, who was the most stringent um, Islamist at that time. Islamic movements emerged as a counter-colonial movement, as Islam was used and mobilized as an ideology to help Muslims stand up for their rights against colonial powers and to take over power with the same cultural, economic, and sociological um, background. This the contradictory discourse of nationalist regimes after the independence, in addition to the contradictions in the Arab monarchies, helped give rise for radical Islamism, because we had two extremism, the extremist Marxism uh, versus the stringent Islamic extremism, both of which were too static and ideologically informed. In Algeria, after independence, the regime needed a source of legitimacy, so it tried to marry two contradictions. The Marxist approach to be pro-poor, in addition to the conservative tendency of the Scholars Association, in order to give Marxism a character that is not contradictory to Islam. And the ministries related to the identity were given to those who are affiliated with the Scholars Association, which was the extension of the reformist um, Arab movement with a Salafi tendency, including the Ministry of Education, endowment, etc. Hence, we had two very contradictory approaches in the state itself. So while the media, the school, and the higher education institutions were working in a conservative tone, other sectors were working in a totally secular mode. So this ideological blending uh, reflects the poverty of the intellectual elites after independence, who were obsessed with power and unaware of their new roles after colonialism, and they were obsessed with everything that has to do with the legitimacy of their group. Working on the religious discourse in line with their political working, instead of putting religion in a neutral, impartial position, caused the emergence of ideologically informed entities. And during the 70s, this time, Islamist elites whose discourse started to change after the defeat of 1967 and the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, and those ideological changes and manifestations, they started to come up against Arab regime, accusing them of failing the nation because of failing to uphold religion. And it was this populism that changed from a social movement into an Islamic anti-regime movement. And so they started to call for a political order that is in line with Sharia, and it represents, or it attributes, the poverty and backwardness of Muslim societies to the lack of religiosity among leaders, and they called for leaders to be just and to be ruled by the orders of God. So they said that they had to overcome secular communist order. This was the discourse by Islamists, which was very similar to that um, of the nationalist groups or movements. The only difference was in the way in which the Islamist discourse was made using the religious wordings and terms of Islam, justice, and equality. So they called for spreading virtue, and hence they started to call for the implementation of Sharia. Islamism is a mixture of ambitions made by historical conditions of deprivation. It is not a religious movement, but a political one, not only seeking to use or to reach power, but also to use religion as a political movement. So it has to overcome its utopian uh, views and idealist views.
تجاوزها مع تجربة ممارسة السلطة.
Looking at Islamic movements from that perspective would help us understand the Islamic or their experience within the political order. So the transformations that political Islam saw witnessed in Algeria since the 90s until today themselves support those propositions and allow us to understand why this pluralist experience failed without falling into a stereotypical overgeneralizations. Actually, studying armed violence in Algeria in the 90s based on the second approach or proposition, which I just explained, would allow us to understand the transformation of this Islamic movement from a radical armed movement to a political nonviolent movement that is one of the pillars of the existing power or authority. This is in terms of the theoretical background of the roots of Islamism in Algeria. But why has this political order moved towards or tilted towards violence? The violence in Algeria during the 90s cannot at all be explained using the scripture or the sacred texts used by the Islamic leaders at the time, nor by the inclinations of the stringent Islamic movement. Although the use of those texts may be attractive for media outlets, but it is incapable of explaining that violence which many Algerians were victims to. The actual explanation is due to the collision of two utopian ideologies. One was nationalist populist, and the other was Islamic populist. Both were extremists, and this clash started to put people in a way that they were more inclined to join the radical Islamism because that populism in itself was more effective in popular mobilization when people are mobilized against a political rival during peacetime or an external enemy during wartime. For example, this is what was used in the Liberation Revolution against the French a colonization because of the combination of the radicalism and the elitism of the scholars association. As for the populism of the Islamic Salvation Front, this is attributed to the fact that it is the only movement that was able to take up the legacy of the populist Islamic Front, which was the only one that kept up the revolutionary discourse and rhetoric. The Islamic Salvation Front, in that sense, is the child of the previous Islamic populist movement. And the difference is that this new movement was an ideological nationalist movement, while the first, which is the Salvation Islamic movement, was a populist movement, which was one of the manifestations of the liberation movement, and it actually accused the liberation movement for failing to represent the revolution and the state and the society, for being away from the values of religion, claiming to want to install people who were not concerned with worldly matters. But when we take a look at their program, there will be many common denominators with the program of the nationalist populist movement. The only difference would be the multiple references to the Holy Quran to highlight the Islamic point of reference. And the state, in that view, deprived that movement from their legitimate right, in their view, to establish their Islamic state. And they claimed that was because the leaders did not observe religious principles, and that's why they took up arms against them. For uh, as for the state or the authority, they thought this Islamic Salvation Front, they constituted an existential threat, and those in authority admitted they were unable to meet the expectations of the people, particularly given the economic conditions and the oil prices, etc. But for the Islamic Salvation Front, they had the resources, but and they thought that Algeria as a state had enough resources, but its connections to the West, corruption, theft, lack of justice, and being away from Islamic doctrine was the reason, in their view, for that failure. Neither the National Salvation Liberation Front nor the Islamic opposition were looking at the political arena as an arena to settle the disagreements or struggle for power, or the state as the way to do that, and society as a group of people who have interests that are conflicting and colliding. But each of them had a communitarian understanding of society, and uh, they divided people between traitors and nationalists. All those who did not accept the one party rule were nationalists, and being part of the liberation war was an essential condition for involvement in authority after that. As for the Islamic Salvation Party, on the other hand, they also divided people into believers or Muslims and non-Muslims, or uh, disbelievers. Both movements seek to establish a state and a society that is void of social discrepancies and differences. As for the Liberation Front, they thought that affiliating with and adopting national values was enough, and they refused any disturbance of national unity as for Islamic salvation. They called for a restoration of Islamic Sharia, and neither fronts in their political agendas based their work on modern political values such as the freedom of assembly, separation of powers, etc. Liberations for both open the floor for individuals and communities to disturb public order and to trespass values and religion. Both movements have contradictory views of the political order. On the one hand, they believe there needs to be some independent institutions that practice control, or that they don't see the necessity of such uh, institutions to control the state. They believe that faith in God would be enough, while on the other hand, they see the state as an apparatus that controls or inspects people and their society. And based on that ideological background, after the events of October and after the slipping into violence, we reached the point where they, Islamic Salvation Front reached the majority in the parliament.
Speaking about the electoral track, it has to do with the psychology of interpreting how two utopian projects contradicting together led to confrontation amongst each other and brought Algeria into a track of violence. The elections and the moderate Islamists in power. Went back to the elections in the 90s, and in 1997, after amending the constitution for the other movement. And when we look at the Islamic movements in the 20 years where Bouteflika led Algeria, we can see that the power and Islamists learned a lot of lessons that has to do to improve the relations amongst each other. We will try first to look at these different shifts and to learn some lessons from this experience. First, the shifts of the Islamists of Algeria. I'll try to be brief. The radical current, they participated in the elections in December 91, and the authority prevented them by a judicial ruling, and they selected to have a military confrontation with the authority, and it ended with their defeat. The Muslim Brotherhood current, it is represented by the peaceful peace society in 1997, which was led by Mahfouz Nahnah. This movement led from the tragic defeat and the lessons learned from the Salafi movement. So turned its name to the peaceful society, because the Constitution of 1997 prevents the establishment of parties on a religious or ethnic background. So they tried to get away from the opposition. They got into the authority. They became part of it, and they received the portfolios of some ministries. And in the 1990s, 1999, they worked with Bouteflika. In part of that, it represents the results of the elections of the Islamic movements in that period. And we found that by time Hamas movement lost a lot of its constituency in the number of seats that they received in the national parliament. In 1998, they had 69 seats. In 2021, they got only 65 seats, although the I need to ask you, how much time more do you need? 6 or 7 minutes. You have already spoke for 30 minutes. So try to conclude, please. So in terms of the shifts, we found that Hamas took a lot of ministerial portfolios, and they didn't get the sovereign ministerial or the ministries that has to do with the identity or the education. They got the ministries that had a lot of funds, like the social affairs and works ministry, the ministry of industry, ministry of resources, ministry of public works. They continue to receive the ministerial portfolios in the presidential alliance until 2012, after the withdrawal of some members in after the revolution that took place in Egypt and in Tunisia. There is also a shift of Islamists from radicalization to moderation, and Hamas can be today uh, a club for contractors and businessmen more than a reformist movement the movement that it was in the beginning. And a lot of changes happened to them, and it turned into just another party like other parties. That's why I say that the divisions that were known in the Islamic movements are normal, because it is a political movement. The national liberation movement also uh, was similar to other parties or the democratic parties, so, and they had some cracks. So the division is a normal thing that happens in all of the parties, and the revision within the parties is normal also, which means that these movements were just like any other political party that are prone to the dynamics of politics. I will conclude now with the lessons learned. The radical Islam cannot be part of the political landscape in the modern state. It depends on a utopian vision that contradicts with the nation state. The modern world is built on the system of or the paradigm of nation state, where there are relations with other countries. The current world order doesn't recognize any kind of state other than the nation state, and the perceptions of the Islam, political Islam, is based on the traditional or tribal relations instead of the political relations. The defeat of the radical Islam is an uh, uh, decisive point in history, and their understanding or their presence cannot survive in this world. The Islamic radical traditional movements in the beginning, when they start, they have some momentum, but when the society understands that they are unable to develop, they leave it or abandon it. The second lesson is that in the past 20 years of the partisan participation and the practice in powers, most of the Islamists lost their constituency, which means that society looks at these movements as political movements, not as reformative salvation movements. So without having a political vision, they become just like any normal political party, and sometimes some of the worst political parties. Sometimes they get closer to the rentier distribution circles in the power, in the authority, or fight other Islamic movements. The end of these movements that they will be excluded or contempted by the society, because they prefer to interfere or to participate in the power regardless of their constituencies' demands. So if they continue to do that, they will be at the end only political parties as opportunistic as any other political party, no matter how many Islamic slogans they use. The other lesson, the shifts that the Islamic movements in Algeria and the integration that happened in these movements shows the flexibility and the capability of these movements to adapt and to work in the political landscape. And that is the improvement that that they want to show away from the accusations that they receive that they are static and they don't develop by time. This acceptance affected the ideological and political aspects of the movement, and it is brings us to the post-Islamists or the post-radical period. And it is not affected by the Islamic movements themselves, but because of the context they are functioning in. The other lesson, the continuation of moderate movements, so or having any moderate Islamic movements in presence, despite the oppression of the political authority and the enmity of the neighboring countries to them, shows that there could be no peaceful society without Islamists, and the elections is the only way to integrate them politically and to have them compete in the elections under the condition that they abide by the rules of the game and to abandon any utopian ideology. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry that I spoke more than the time allocated for me. Thank you very much, Mr. Nouri. Actually, it is very difficult to summarize this rich paper, regardless whether people agree or disagree with what you said. I will try to give the headlines of what you said. He said that the Islamic movement or political Islam in Algeria has some features that distinguish it from other countries in the Arab world. And this paper tries to understand the historical roots of the political Islam in Algeria and the reasons that made it the first experience of plurality that tends to use violence in the 90s. It tries to see the ideological and structural changes that happened in the Islamic movements because they were that was the alternative that the authority encouraged to replace the radical Islam. He said that it starts from the a theory that Islam is a political movement and not a religious movement, so it can adapt and improve according to the political context. He started with two methodological comments or notes. The first one is that there are two approaches of the Islam and the political Islam. The first one speaks about trying to understand the Islamic societies through the founding or the foundational texts of Islam.
والنظرة الثانية وهي التي تتكلم عن الإسلام في محيط أو سياق أنثروبولوجي، وأنه لم يعد هو الوعاء الذي يحتوي كل المجتمع، بل هو موضوع يحتاج إلى الفهم والتأويل من خلال مجموعة من الرموز والممارسات التي في المجتمع. فهناك إسلام مغاربي وإسلام إندونيسي بمعنى بالمحتوى الأنثروبولوجي. تحدث عن جذور الإسلاموية، ما سماه الإسلاموية أو الإسلام السياسي في الجزائر. قال أن ظروفها أو جذورها في الظروف التاريخية والخصائص الثقافية للمجتمعات، حينما بدأ من بونابرت ومحمد عبده ثم الإخوان وسقوط الخلافة ثم سيد قطب ومرساد عبد الناصر ثم أبو الأعلى المودودي، بمعنى هذه السياق الذي يعتبر لرموز الحركة الإسلامية في العالم الإسلامي وتأثيره على الإسلام السياسي في الجزائر. فقال أن في الجزائر كان هناك نظام بعد الاستقلال يحتاج إلى سردية تمنح له الشرعية، فجمع بين متناقضين الإيديولوجيا الماركسية حتى يظهر أنه في صف الكادحين والمقهورين ولا يظهر كمجسد للإمبريالية، وأن هناك أيضا خصوصية جزائرية في هذا المسألة بأنها لا تعادي الدين الذي تعاديه الشيوعية، وبالتالي كان هناك دمج لجمعية العلماء المسلمين الذين كانوا يعطوا من الوزارات أو من المؤسسات التي تتحدث عن الهوية، في حين أن الوزارات التقنية كانت تعطى للجانب الآخر. قال أن الإسلام السياسي أو ما يسميه الإسلاموية تختلف عن الصوفية في كونها تفسر الفقر واللامساواة وتخلف المسلمين عن الغرب لفساد المسلمين وابتعادهم عن تعاليم الإسلام، والمطالبة بالحكم بما أنزل الله وبالعدل، وبالتالي يعني لها خطاب متعلق بها، وهي مزيج من الطموحات الحداثية والأوهام الطوبوية التي صنعتها ظروف تاريخية تتميز بالحرمان والتخلف والفقر الموجود في المجتمع، ولكنه لا يعتبرها حركة دينية بل سياسية تستخدم الدين كمورد سياسي ليس فقط للوصول إلى السياسة إلى السلطة بل لاستخدام نظامه المعياري والأخلاقي لتسيير الحقل السياسي. وكونه حركة سياسية تريد الوصول إلى السلطة فهي مدعوة إلى تجاوز أوهامها اليوتوبية ونزعتها نحو العنف والتشدد. في سؤال آخر قال: لماذا انحرف الانفتاح السياسي في الجزائر نحو العنف؟ قال أن العنف الذي عرفته الجزائر خلال سنوات التسعينات لا يمكن إطلاقا تفسيره بالبساطة.
The violence that was witnessed in Algeria in the 90s, it was based on the theory that was seen by the politicians in Algeria. This is an oversimplification, and it remains unable to see the changes that took place. The
العشرية السوداء في الجزائر.
presupposition that he starts from in the study that the bloody decade was because of the confrontation of two utopian ideologies. The first one was a popularist and nationalist popularist. The other one was a religious approach, and he came from the Islamic liberation movement and the Islam Front. He says there are three reasons for the continuation of the popularist movement in the Algerian society, and that he talked about the economic problems and the ideological differences, and he said that the Algerian front frustration was the one, and it failed because of it failed to identify how the state was away from religion and couldn't use religion and
باستثناء طبعا استحضار للنصوص الدينية للخطاب. تحدث باستفاضة عن المسار الذي اتخذته الحركة الإسلامية لا سيما حركة حمص أو حركة الإخوان منذ عام.
And then he spoke about the Hims movement since the 1997 and the changes that took place in the amongst the Islamists of Algeria and the Algerian movement for salvation, which is the Salafist current, and the Muslim Brotherhood movement, which was a reformist movement. And he spoke about participation in authority and the different ministries that were occupied by members of the party and the withdrawal from the presidential alliance. And he concluded with the shifts that happened, which was the radical market Islam, and which represents the experience that Hims got into, and there was the movement of Hims from Islam to politician. It was in the beginning when they when they started and with their activity that was based on da'wah and promoting virtue and combating vice, and how they separated that from politics. And that was another shift where the Islamists were unable to take control of the politics. They moved to the economy. He said that the components or the constituency were away from them, and he said that the changes from political Islam to radicalization and the control to power. He concluded his paper with questions and some lessons learned. The first one was that the radical Islam cannot be part of the political landscape of the modern state because they are based on concepts that are contradict with the nation state and with the society. The radical Islam is built on building a caliphate since the beginning, and which disagrees with the nation state and the current the current world doesn't agree with this movement, and this goes against the understanding of the political Islam. The other lesson is not all the Islam Muslim societies contain or constituency for the Islamic movements, and after 20 years of political activity, the Islamic movements lost their constituency, which shows that these movements lost their constituency and that they are merely political movements and not reformative movements or parties. He also says that the political Islam doesn't have a clear political program, and in best scenario, they are normal political movements and they are opportunistic parties. This third lesson, he says that the shifts that were seen by the Islamic movements in Algeria and how they were integrated in the political landscape shows how flexible they are and how they can adapt to the political movement. And this contradicts with the perception that says that their these parties are static and they cannot improve. Is supposed to be a positive remark. And the fourth lesson, he says that there is no peace can be achieved in these societies without these political parties, because they are parts of the society, and the enmity they see from neighboring countries or from the oppression by the authority shows that they are part of the society. But the elections is the only way to integrate them politically and to compete for elections under the condition that they agree with or they accept the rules of the game, of the democratic game. Thank you very much. And now we move to the second speaker by Mr. Ben Azuz Abdulrahman. The floor is yours. Peace be upon you. Uh, Hello, everyone. I would like to thank SIGA for this invitation and Dr. Sami Al Arian for giving me this opportunity to speak about the project of the Islamic movement in general. This is a good opportunity to speak about an update about this movement. I would like also to thank the speakers who provided papers in the morning session. So, the speakers in the first session and Mr. Idris focused on the historical context and about the HIMS movements. Mr. Ben Azuz, your voice, the sound quality is not very good. So if you can stop your Bluetooth microphone, maybe it will be better. We can't hear you now.
هل تسمعونني؟ أنا أسمعك. نعم جيد جدا.
We hear you now very well. So the speakers in the morning said or spoke about hymns and the historical context of the establishment of the Islamic movement in Algeria, and in the 90s when the Salvation Front was established and the popularist Islamic movement in Algeria. So I will try in my section to focus on the remaining or the rest of the Islamic landscape in Algeria, because we have a lot of spectrum in the Islamic movements, and I will focus on four Islamic movements: Al-Nahda movement, the National Reform movement, and the National Building movement. And because The speakers talked about him, so I'm not going to talk about it any further. I will start with the Nahda movement. Nahda movement was established in 1990 with Abdullah Jaballah. Its name was changed in 1996 according to the law of parties to Al-Nahda movement. In 1996, there was a difference between its president Al-Habib Jaballah, and the movement was split into two movements, Al-Nahda and another one that was in line with the president at the time. The head of Al-Nahda movement, sound quality from the speaker is very bad. With the beginning of the popular movement in Algeria, they rejected uh, the election of the president, and when the president nominated himself for a presidency, they said that all the constituency of the society didn't have any acceptance of the president. In line with that, or in parallel with that, the movement didn't want to participate in the elections of 2019, and the popular movement prevented the Bouteflika to be elected for a fifth term. In April 2019, they rejected the call of the authority for dialogue, and they focused that they reject the people who they reject what the people reject. The Secretary General of the movement was a very important figure, and they had a declaration that included some proposals. For example, the president of and the government resign, provided that they will elect or appoint technocratic government in line with the popular movement. In 2019, the movement issued a statement encouraging or appreciating the movement, and then another statement by the Secretary General. They talked about postponing the presidential elections that were supposed to be to be held in June 2019. In terms of the referendum on the constitution that Abdelmajid Tebboune made, the movement rejected the referendum on the constitution in 2020, as the statement 24 on 2020 showed, and they talked about the infringements and the defects that were seen in the referendum, and they wanted to go for elections to vote on the constitutional changes. And the percentage of voters, or the turnout of voters out of 24 million voters, they said that it was a failure, and it shows that there is no willingness of the people to, or that doesn't reflect the willingness of the people in the elections. Based on in the second anniversary of the establishment of the movement, there was a statement issued. In which they said that the Algerian people didn't only rejected the fifth period or the fifth term of the president, but they also highlighted the importance of the terms of reference of the country. On the 23rd of March 2021, the president, Abdelmajid bin Tebboune, welcomed the head of the movement. Afterwards, the Secretary General of Al-Nahda movement made this press statement saying that the meeting talked about domestic and international issues and talked about the coming legislative elections. Of course, this was an attempt by the presidency to attract the movement to support the presidency after the popular movement. Afterwards, the movement announced that it will shoulder its responsibility as a political player and it will participate in the legislative elections. However, unfortunately, the movement paid costs because of that, which led to splits and divisions, and they couldn't have any seats in the legislative elections. After that defeat, the Secretary General issued a statement in which he saluted those who are loyalists and supporter of the movement, and he said that the movement is going to do more work in order to succeed in the domestic elections, which is the municipality and other elections at the local level. Then they they worked on formulating a social contract, and then the movement failed in the local elections and they didn't have any weight. So they didn't win any within any municipality or in any social council. However, the movement was active for in the 3 years that came after the popular movement. They issued statements, and in terms of the foreign policy, they supported the government in different points, like severing the relations with Morocco, the membership in the or the presidency of the African Union, and their also position in the towards the Russian-Ukrainian war. In terms of the national reform movement, of course, the movement was led by Mr. Houini. The national reform movement uh, uh, doesn't issue its formal statements on Facebook, and it doesn't have a website, so their positions are not known to the public. On the 26th of November 2016, it had some activity, and it supported the election of Bouteflika, or the nomination of Bouteflika, on the 12th of December 2012. It supported the president. And with the launch of the popular movement, the head of the movement was embarrassed because he supported Bouteflika in the elections formerly. And then the acting president of the movement, Al-Saleh, tried to issue statements that thanks the army and the people together for their struggle and for the movement. The vision of the movement in terms of the constitutional referendum, and it was similar to the Al-Nahda movement, and it supported the constitutional referendum and its political structure. For example, they supported the constitutional referendum, and they called the citizens to go for the referendum, and they said or they encouraged people to say yes to this constitution in the referendum.
In the legislative elections of 2020, we had the same. So in 2021, the movement won no positions or no seats, despite its openness to alliances. It won no seats. Nonetheless, the head of the movement expressed being at that he was comfortable with the results, although they won not a single seat. So in general, the same applies also to the elections of local councils and legislative councils at the levels of localities and municipalities. The movement had no significant weight at the level of at the national level, so this national reform movement in general was appeasing to the government, and recently we had one of its members assigned as an ambassador to Oman, I believe. And it's not. And the third power is Justice and Development Front. It was established in 2011 after the withdrawal from the reform, and this is one the reform movement. This is one of the mistakes of and the problems of a political arena in Algeria, which is the various dissents and fragmentation. So this Justice and Development Front, in after the its Shura Council met, it declared the continuance of the status quo, which would exacerbate socio-economic crises and the monopoly of power without constitutional backing. And this front declared that it would not provide any candidate for the upcoming presidential elections, but it would cooperate with any political parties to solve the crisis at the beginning, and with the National Commission for Mediation. This group or this movement rejected the request of the coordinator of the moderation commission, saying that they represented an illegitimate power, and that anything that would come out or emerge from those dialogues would be illegal or illegitimate in itself. So in other words, they refused the fifth election of Bouteflika, and then they rejected dialogue with this regime, and they completely rejected political participation or engagement with the decision to establish to start presidential elections. They had a meeting, an extraordinary meeting, to reiterate their mobilization and continued movement, while stopping the restriction on political parties. And this was a continuation of the approach of this movement, which refrained from being involved in the presidential elections since the beginning. The activity of this movement during the popular uprising or upheaval was rather active, whether through its head, Mr. Jaballah, who discussed many intellectual issues which were published on their official Facebook page. Also, the Justice and Development Front declared that it would take part in the legislative elections, but their participation was limited, and they won only 2 seats at the level of legislative bodies. And in terms of the constitutional referendum, they reiterated the rejection of the constitution amendment projects. The same applies to the elections, local elections of the municipalities and local councils. They had no significant weight. In the 3rd anniversary of the popular uprising, they issued a statement welcoming this popular movement. They welcomed that popular movement, and they called for coordination between the opposition and the popular movement. So their activity was mostly intellectual, but nonetheless, this Justice and Development Front did not undertake its political responsibilities and only tried to lay the blame on the political authorities. So they were rather passive, although others were more courageous and forthcoming in their engagement. The other movement is in the national building movement. It was established by Mustafa bin Mahdi in 2013, and it was licensed in the same year by the Ministry of Interior, and it included a number of leaders from the Change Front, which descended from the Hams, and we had representatives of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, from Egypt in Algeria. The Murshid office assigned a general Murshid, or a guide for the Muslim Brotherhood in Algeria to avoid dissent. And that was after Mustafa bin Mahdi took part in the 8th Conference of Islamic Movements in Khartoum, Sudan. Of course, this was in continuance of the circulation of power within political parties. We had a successor to Mustafa bin Mahdi who resigned because he was unable to continue in his position, and his replacement directly declared openness to allying with other Islamist powers in order to achieve and coordinate in furtherance of their common purposes. This movement was cautious at the beginning, given the chaos that the state witnessed at the beginning. At the beginning, the movement was very smart in dealing with the authorities. So in October of 2018, where the country or the state was pushed towards the unknown, this movement called the people to protect the state institutions and refrain from inciting chaos and upholding the national interest. And another statement by that movement declared that it was keen on having presidential elections, and I was open to all options, including involvement and having a candidate run for presidency. So from the very beginning, this movement was willing and wanting to be involved in presidential elections, and one intended to participate in those elections. In 2022 February 2019, the group issued a statement in which it valued the peaceful expression of opinions by the Algerian people and reiterated the non-violent character of this uprising. So this is really a very cautious movement in terms of its rhetoric. So they used very smart terminology. They never used direct terms in or stark terms in addressing the authorities. After Abdul Qadir bin Saleh, the provisional president, had his speech, the movement issued a statement a day after, commenting on the speech, that it receives it with much comfort, and reiterated the importance of responding to the public demands in an unconditional dialogue. That was very important, and the movement said that it would work with the public uprising in order to reach for its aspirations and purposes, along with the army as well, which means that the movement acknowledged the role of the army in the different historical periods, in addition to the contemporary history of Algeria. With the election or recommendation of Mr. Suleiman as the Secretary General and the head of this movement, the movement thanked all of those who recommended this person to this position and considered this the beginning of a new chapter for the movement and a continuation of its effort. It issued another statement in 2019, in August 2019, in which it declared a meeting with the Mediation Commission in which they submitted their vision of the political solutions on the 20th of September 2019. The movement declared its participation in the elections decided in 2019 to nominate Mr. Abdel Qadir bin Garina to run for president. How long do you need? I believe less than 5 minutes. Okay, go ahead. So this movement took part in the presidential elections and it ranked second. Its candidate ranked second and with 17.8% of the votes. And the movement also took part in legislative elections, and it also supported the constitutional referendum with a yes, and advocated agreeing for that constitutional referendum. And in those legislative elections in which the movement was involved, in 2021, they received 40 high-ranking positions in the parliament, in addition to also the elections at the local and the municipal level, as they received more than 1,800 seats. In addition to also the state level councils. So this movement, although it is nascent in comparison to others, it was able to actively and positively interact with the public uprising or movement. I tried to introduce this chronology of the development of events for those political parties, although there were discrepancies between those political parties. So some of them received no seats whatsoever, while others have secured high positions within the political order. This remains to be further studied and understood. Thank you so much, and I apologize for taking too long. Thank you so much, Mr. bin Azuz Abdul Rahman, who spoke in his presentation about the experiences of the Islamic movements in politics in Algeria, particularly after 2019. He said that there were some observers who were concerned about the prospect of or the potential return of Islamists, and they were concerned about the return of the 90s, but those concerns did not take into consideration the deep transformations that took place in the state and society over the past couple of decades. He used a descriptive approach or methodology in talking and describing about the views and works of this of these political movements. He talked about the three movements, the three periods before the public uprising, during the public uprising, and after. He talked about the different political positions, the results of the elections, and the outcomes which those various movements got to. For example, we see in Homs received 160 seats, and the National Building Movement got 43 seats, while Justice and Development received less, and Al-Nahda had no seats whatsoever. Maybe in the present or in the comment of Mr. Jalal, we will comment on both papers and arrive at certain specific conclusions, after which we will give the chance for both our speakers to provide us with final remarks before we close the session. Thank you so much, Dr. Sami. Peace be upon you all. Can you hear me properly? Okay, good. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for your presentations. I am expected now to give some comments or remarks or my contemplation about the content of those presentations and about some of the ideas probably posed in the previous session. I will start, first of all, with certain critical remarks that I have written down when I read the paper of Mr. Noor Idris. It seems that Dr. Noor Idris is using political Islam instead of Islamic movements, and this use of terms is essential. We need to discuss which terms we use, and it may be worth asking Mr. Idris why he opted for that choice of word and whether he believes that this is related to a specific ideological connotation. And also, when he started speaking, he said that when this political Islam started in Algeria, it started as a radical popular or populist movement, which was allowed by the political opening up at the beginning of the 90s, being involved in the first populist or public elections. I believe that this neglects the religious or Islamic trait of Algerian politics even before independence. So we are ignoring this Islamic trait even of the national movement in Algeria, and he talks about political Islam as a manifestation of modernism and a manifestation of Muslims' engagement in modernism. I believe there may be some sort of a stereotypical or judgmental sort of approach in which the scholar has been referring to those societies. He's not talking about modernism as a number of manifestations, but as a set of values, as a package. So anyone who would be listening to this presentation by Mr. Noor Idris would notice that he talks from theoretical, Western theoretical theories or viewpoints. So this presentation presumes that those theoretical approaches are suitable and timeless even if those are critical and impartial, such as the approach of Gartris that the researcher talked about. I believe that this over dependency on those approaches may give us an understanding, an interpretation that is not correct about the situation in our countries, because those theories emerged in a totally different context. So this approach makes this scholar, makes him convinced from the beginning as a point of departure in the idea of uh, removing the political character from, or the religious character from, the political practice of um, Islamic or political Islam. So, and I believe that this runs contrary to the foundations of political Islam or Islamic movements, and I believe that such presumptions may hinder the clear interpretation of this phenomenon. Actually, those are presumptions that actually hope that Islam would be totally away from politics instead of dealing with it as part and parcel of the political landscape. And the other issue that he talked about in about the roots of Islamism in Algeria, he said that this phenomenon was the product of sociological, cultural aspects of society, and those are the principles adopted by many sociologists, although this is a way of looking at things that regards Islamism as a reactionary movement rather than an essential or self-standing movement, independent from surrounding points of reference. So those Islamic movements have been, it can be said, have been very often the result of human discretion and contemplation on the sacred scripture, while those environmental factors, which Mr. Nouri mentioned as the source of the emergence of Islamism, were various. In other words, this reason was dependent rather than independent or self-standing. So also another idea about, and I'm trying here to question the points of departure of the speaker, and I hope to hear from him his response, because those points of departure led us in a specific direction, because he said that the political order after independence needed a form of a source of legitimacy. So it had two contradictions. The one, on the one hand, the Marxist pro-poor policies in addition, or ideology, in addition to supporting the Islamic Scholars Association, and he gave high positions or ministries to the Marxists, as well as affiliates to the Association of Muslim Scholars, and this led him to the conclusion that Algeria was evolving on two different rhythms, while the sectors of education and media were working on a religious conservative tone. The other sectors were progressive and pro-Western. And here it seems that this tone betrayed that there's this presumption about Islamic movements. While can you actually hear me? While it seems that this tension between Algerian uh, strugglers in Algeria against colonization in general, pre-independence, was the reason for the rise of this polarity, rather than something that emerged right after the independence. In his analysis, it seemed that the political authority had always the upper hand in controlling all the other factors, and that the other actors were mere tools in the hands of the authority, as depriving those other actors of any sense of agency. And he said that this is what led us to saying that all the deadlocks and clashes that happened later in the state can be attributed to this ideological fabrication, to use his words. And I believe this is too much of an exaggeration that needs to be supported by evidence. And he also said, importantly, an idea about modernism, which is considered the philosophical framework of this lecture. It seemed to me that this paper, when I read it, it seems that modernism for the author was the ultimate end of the state. So we cannot imagine any purpose for the state or governance without modernism. So the state is not viable unless it is seeking modernism. So this is a sort of perspective that would inevitably lead us to those conclusions. That's why we always need to question those assumptions uh, from which we on which we build our um, work. There is also what he mentioned when he said that there are reasons for the deviation of political openness and slipping into violence in 1990s. He said that violence in this black decade in Algeria is attributed to this clash between two utopian ideologies, both of which were a manifestation of modernization itself. The first was populist nationalist, and he's speaking about the authority or the political order, and the other was populist Islamist or religious, which is Islamists in this case. And then this populism fed into radicalism. And I believe that this kind of interpretation or explanation of political phenomenon are obsessed with a sort of equilibrium or balance when you want to attribute or explain the reasons for the Black Decade in Algeria without wanting to lay the blame on a particular party. But I believe that a scholar has to focus in his research about on the actual reasons for those decade for this violence, because this analysis ignores the patriarchal and paternal tendency of the state, of the regime, which started to see itself as the only party that has the right to rule and decide the best interest of the state, etc. So if we start from a different assumption in explaining this decade, if the opposition was a liberal movement or a nationalist movement, would the regime at the time deal with it in the same manner in which it dealt with the Islamic Salvation Front? My answer to this, I assume, is yes, because you know that power has its magic in making people think they have absolute power and absolute authority. And we all remember that the political order or the political regime at the time was talking about Algeria becoming a new Afghanistan, etc. And in this paper, I also noticed that the researcher ignored the role of external factors in explaining this slipping into violence after political openness. And those external factors, including what France did at the time, many sociological studies, even in French literature, show that they talk about the Algerian society, which reached peak time in or an important threshold in the 80s and had a chance to transform or make the transition towards democracy. But France at the time started to think that if Algeria continues in this way, Algeria would be too independent in its external relations, and this would constitute a threat to French interests in Algeria. So those interpretations would attribute this violence in the 90s to the French sense of a threat, or at least in part. So their concern about the emergence of political parties and the precursors of democratic transition. We know also that there were some structural changes in the world order at the time with the fall of the Soviet Union, which means that which meant that Algeria lost an important ally, uh, making it concerned about the collapse of the state, particularly that there were many states that collapsed at the time after the fall of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet support of many states caused their collapse, or failure to support caused them to collapse. So I believe analyzing that period would necessitate understanding those the implications of those international factors. How much time do I have, Dr. Sami?
نعم.
كم تحتاج أخي؟ كم تحتاج؟
10 دقائق ماكسيموم.
I need 10 minutes max. No, you don't have 10 minutes, 5 minutes only. Okay, I'll try to be brief. Okay, and another point in the paper. In another point, Dr. Dries spoke about Hamas movement and how they occupied many technical ministries like the industry and others, whereas in another time the Islamists were, for example, or wanted to get a lot of the ministries that are related with the identity, like the media or education. So the question here is why the Islamists started to get into the market Islam, as a lot of thinkers speak, and that this is an impediment to the modernity, as the researcher suppose. One of the reasons why the Hams was withdrew from the presidential alliance with the beginning of the Arab Spring, whether it found itself an opportunity to renew its legitimacy as an opposition party, or they were waiting a certain foreign intervention or support? These questions require to be answered. As for the paper of Mr. Abdul Rahman and some of the ideas on the interventions of the speakers in the first session, the period of the movement, just as any popular movements or uprisings, these uprisings reveal the uh, the origin of so many movements or parties.
هذا الحراك بالنسبة
For
للإسلام
me, this Islamic movement was or showed the the popular movement or the popular uprising showed the delusion of the Islamic movements that they are able to mobilize people. And some people, for example, said that they were the reason. A speaker from Hamas in the morning said that we were the reason of the movement, of the popular movement, and that's how they are delusional, thinking that they mobilize people and they use this mobilization popularism in their work. The uh, conflicts on identity were used heavily only to have more popularist tendency here or there, and it went into a lot of conflicts. And I believe that this is only a kind of tendency or just to show that these movements have any kind of influence in the society. I have another comment on the period of the mobilization or the uprising, which was the background of Muslim Brotherhood to some of the Islamic movements. For example, the youth of Hams movement and other movements that are coming up from a Muslim Brotherhood background, the youth of these movements, they have some kind of explosion in their terms of reference. So this is something that requires in detail and in-depth study. And some people moved to the Salafist tendencies or currents, and they became more Salafist than the Salafists themselves. And some of them start to think in the neo-Islamist school of thought, so to speak. So this presupposition is a jump, concluding from what we see in Clubhouse or social media about concluding from the explosion in the terms of reference of those people in Algeria. We also said that the speaking of terms of reference, it makes me refer quickly to the uh, obsession of the Islamists in Algeria and in the Arab world in general about the identity, which makes Islamists prisoners of history. As one of the speakers in the first session said, he was saying that the role of history is very important to define the vision, etc., etc. But usually, when or the countries that make history an inspiration for their tracks instead of having it at terms, or they make it an inspiration instead of having it as static terms of reference for them, because when it is an inspirational they can be dynamic to adapt to the new changes in a way or another. And the Islamists were unable to get out of of that prison of history. They remained prisoners of history in a way or another. Again, in the context of terms of reference, during the uprising, we found that there was conflict of terms of reference amongst Islamists themselves or the nationalists and Islamists, and they were using that history or that past heavily. The nationalists had their platform, and the Islamists have theirs, and there was a kind of showing as some uh, the religious dimension of the November Declaration or another. I believe so. This Don Quixotean or fighting with the mills conflict is not useful for the improvement of countries. It usually impedes development in the countries instead of making these Islamic movements, instead of holding the authority accountability, monitoring the performance of the government, etc. And that's why the Islamic or the Algerian authority was able to eliminate any competitor to authority. And from these conflicts of terms of reference, the authority was the only winner because it cornered everyone or put everybody busy with that fight while the authority remained in the hands of those in power. One final point, very quickly, is the foreign policy or the perception of those Islamic movements of foreign policy. It is very difficult, and we will do them. We will not be doing them justice to argue that the Islamists, for example, have a certain orientation or tendency or vision in foreign policy if they are not in power in Algeria or not in the decision-making circles. So we cannot judge their or the nature of these visions. However, through a statement here or there, or some positions or some discussions that with the Islamists about what happens in the international arena or the regional arena, we can conclude or understand what they think in those issues. What I see is the matter of the foreign policy, and I used to write about that usually, that the Islamists and the Muslim Brotherhood movements in general are not mature enough to understand what is happening at the international level and to understand the changes or to get into the matters of the foreign relations or the foreign affairs in terms of Algeria. So this is instilled when we hear their statements about some issues, for example, about what happens in the Western Desert or the Ukraine and Russia war now. And I will conclude with this sentence. Uh, One of the speakers in the first session, Mr. Bouh, maybe, he said that there is a claim that there is conformity in the perception of the foreign policy with Homs and the Algerian state. I believe that this is only a claim that requires a lot of evidence to do that. He is speaking about the opposition of some leaders to the regime of Boumediene, and he mentioned Dr. Mahfouz Nahna or Sultan Sleimani, may they all rest in peace. He spoke how they were against the regime of Boumediene, his socialist tendency, etc., etc. Talking about the grandchildren of the Hams now with the uprising, they are the same, they are opposing the Algerian regime the same way with those in the past. What is the relation between this period and that period? Everybody knows that during the Cold War, uh, the United States was using the Islamists against the Soviet Union, and the Islamists put themselves a tool in the policy of major countries. The United States managed to use them, whether in Turkey or other areas or Algeria, especially that we're speaking about Algeria. So they used them as opposition against the regimes that were well established, as happened with Hams. The Arab Spring revolutions that took place, I believe that they are not disengaged from this geopolitical conflict that is happening between the major countries. So the Arab Spring in general, in its geopolitical context, they are not unlinked with or not related with the revolutions that took place in Europe, and that's the United States that is trying to democratize the regions or to liberalize these regions against the regimes that or the other systems that we have, like China or Russia. When those so many countries where these revolutions erupted, they were having strengthened relations with China and Russia. So the United States wanted to hinder the ability of Russia and China to get more influence in those regions and try to change these regimes to have more democratic change regimes in the realm of the democratic the democratic Western realms, and all of the Islamic movements are speaking about democracy, and we can see that and now they, as we see the Hams movements, they are speaking about the democratization and the moving into the liberal realm, and that leaves me with a comment that do the Islamists understand that in the major geopolitical changes in the world, they were always tools that were used by this power or that power in these conflicts? This always makes me raise a question, the final question. For example, if Hams or another Islamic movement got to power in Algeria, would that be a threat for the established tradition of the foreign policy in Algeria, which usually tries to be in a neutral position in foreign policy and what I called in the last session that we have the hedging strategy that usually some countries that are not related to conflicts may take. Thank you very much for listening to my comments. Thank you, Jalal, for your comments. Now we have only 11 minutes, so I will give 6 minutes to Dr. Nouri and 5 to Mr. Ben Azuz, and try to answer, try to select the points that you want to respond to. Thank you very much, and I would like to thank Mr. Jalal for his comments, and this opens the opportunity to raise new questions and new approaches, and I will try to respond to what I believe are in the context. Why I call them political Islam and not Islamic movements? Islamic movements not always political movements, and some political Islamic movements that are not, or political movements that are not Islamic da'wah movement. And so that's why I use the political Islam, because they are all the political movements or parties that use Islam as their terms of reference to work in politics or to have political activity with an Islamic background, whether, for example, talking about applying Sharia or part of it in their political program. Then why or what why I am speaking, talking about democratization or liberalism, and they are contradicting with the political Islam. I believe that I needed maybe or modernity. I needed 2 hours maybe to explain the terminology that I'm using. When I'm speaking about modernity, I'm speaking about some a generic, using it as generic terms. The Islamic movement, they speak about justice, equality, the respect of everyone, and the state that has no corruption. All the Muslim community or societies, when they hear such a discourse, they want to have this state. Is that implemented in the West when they separated the religion from the state and they have democracy? So they applied the rule of law. But for the Islamists, when they are speaking about justice, equality, and all of the other values, they present them, but in a way that is contradictory, because they say, for example, that they will apply Sharia to monitor the politicians in order to apply that. So it means that they keen modernity, but they are using different terminology. And in the same context, why did I say that the Arabism or national Arabism and the Islamists, they are two ideologies. Modernity started in the West, and it came to us through colonization, and the colonization made the nationalistic approach or ideology, and which wanted the Arab nationalists and wanted to involve the Islamic or societies in the political work. The roots of the Islamic movements go back to the time of the Arab Renaissance and Muhammad Abdo, who which led to the Muslim Brotherhood, and that led to Sayyid Qutb and all the other movements that we have. So the continuity of modernity that came from colonization, I'm not judging it whether it is good or not. It's just a description of a certain system, political system or governance system. This shock was the one that produced these two ideologies that through time were introduced, and maybe at some time, as a result of the modernity, there will be we will overcome these two ideologies. And now, for example, we have the moderate Islamic movements, and they are moving towards adapting with those societies, which means that they are responding to a societal need, and they are trying to be as part of the society, just like other Christian modern parties. The radical Christian parties, they became political parties. The final point. Mr. Jalal was asking whether the regime was dealing with the this front of salvation. If another one who came to power, I believe the purpose of research is to understand the interpretation of what happened is a different way. I don't know, but I may expect that it would be different. But my interpretation of the reaction of the regime and what made the regime act in such a way will be different from the interpretation that you presented. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Idris. And now we give the floor to Mr. Azuz. Thank you very much. My comments on what Mr. Jalil said about the terms of reference and the changes in the terms of reference and the youth on the new generation of the Islamic movements. I believe one of the problems that the political Islamic movements or parties that are suffering is having the partisan division and ideological change. The former generations were the sponsors of the present and the future of the present. So, which means that they are raising up the new generations, and if they are not doing that, this is leading to a generational gap or generational conflict between the first generation and the coming generation, which is which might lead to more division or more split in the movements. So, those Islamic movements should understand or should start restructuring themselves as a party and not to depend on popularist movement or any other polarization or other approaches. They should, for example, clarify the role, the vision, and the purpose of the parties, how they act in elections and in the all the political activities. When you talked about the obsession of the Islamists to governance, I hope that they reach power in order to deal directly with the authority and understand how to deal with the power immediately. For example, the Moroccan Justice and Development, they won in elections for 2 terms. And in the recent elections, they failed and they are not in the government anymore. So that is a proof that they failed at the level of the sectoral public policies within the state. So those parties should be aware that playing a role in opposition is completely different from being in power, and that they will learn a lot when they practice governance themselves. These are my remarks. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Ben Azuz. Thank you, Mr. Idris Nouri. This session was very rich, and it raised more questions than providing answers, actually. So we need another session maybe to discuss further the points that were raised in this session. Thank you indeed. Tomorrow we will be talking about the 13th experience, the experience of Morocco, the case of Morocco, and the experience of the Islamic movements there, and it will be similar to this. We will have two sessions. The first session will be 2:30 Istanbul time, 12:30 Greenwich time, and then it will be followed by another, or the final session for 2 hours or 2 hours and a half. Thank you very much for being with us today. See you tomorrow. Peace be upon you all.